Hello friends at Viking Cruises. My name is Chris Johnson. I serve as the president of Vesterheim Norwegian American Museum here in Decorah, Iowa. Join us as our expert staff give a sneak peek into the galleries and rarely seen artifacts you will encounter during your exclusive Mississippi River Cruises Lacrosse Shore Excursion tour to Vesterheim. Enjoy the program.
Welcome to Decorah, Iowa. This bustling town of 8,000 residents is nestled among the tree-clad bluffs of a meteor-packed crater 470 million years old. Founded in the mid-1800s, the town was developed in part by a large population of Norwegian immigrants. Luther College soon emerged and became an important fixture of the region. Today, the town boasts a blend of small-town charm and urban convenience. Beneath the brim of limestone palisades now thrives a community famed for Seed Savers Exchange, the Decorah Eagles, a prolific arts and music community, and 2 award-winning microbreweries. Crowning the assemblage of business and traffic along the downtown is the National Norwegian American Museum and Folk Art School. Welcome to Vesterheim. Vesterheim is the largest Norwegian American museum in the world. We've asked expert archivist Jennifer Kavarik to help us navigate Vesterheim's exhibit spaces and layered past.
Vesterheim has over 33,000 objects in its collection, and it got its start at Luther College in 1877. The museum's collection started out as a teaching collection for the boys who were attending Luther College at that time. But very soon, the collection shifted focus, or gained another focus, which was to actively collect the history of Norwegian Americans, or Norwegian immigrants to America, which were happening at that time, the year when the 100th anniversary celebration was going on, to celebrate the first organized group of Norwegian immigrants to the United States. Those were known as the Sloopers. A professor at Luther College, Knut Gjerseth, was charged with creating exhibits to share the Norwegian experience here in America and to celebrate those Sloopers. He had a correspondence going with Anders Sandvig, who was the founder of Myhaugen Museum, which is in Lillehammer. And the two of them apparently struck up quite a friendship, in such to the point that Anders actually helped get a lot of objects from different museum collections here to Vesterheim. So as we kind of look around this room, a number of these pieces that you see here are from that 1925 gift from Norwegian museums to this museum here. Norwegian museums really wanted the Norwegians in America to remember their heritage, to remember their traditions, and so that's what this house represents. Not everybody in Norway lived in houses with multiple rooms. In fact, a lot of people would have lived in a single room house. This particular room functions as a bedroom. Right behind me here is a bed. It functions as a kitchen. There's a fireplace in here, which also serves to heat the house. It functions as a dining room here. We have a table, and also perhaps the living room too. And you'll see a lot of the furniture is pushed around to the outside of the walls, because this has to be a multifunctional room in the house. Lots of activities and perhaps lots of people in this particular space. What's great about this particular house is that you can use it, or you can picture perhaps what it might have been like for Norwegians to live in Norway and then to think about leaving a house like this or with similar furnishings. People who were coming to the United States from Norway in the 19th and early 20th centuries would recognize a lot of these pieces here. And I oftentimes like to imagine what it would have been like to be in a house like this and then to have to choose things from my life, from my experience, to bring to my new life and my new experience in America, and to think about getting all of that into a trunk.
That is a heavy question. The belongings that made their way to the United States were ultimately the remnants of Norwegian livelihoods and legacies that immigrant families used to begin a new life in the Americas. These first artifacts of Norwegian immigration form the basis of Norwegian American identity and tradition today. Of course, immigrants and their belongings had to cross the Atlantic Ocean by boat. Vesterheim's Ship Gallery, a 3-story exhibit, testifies to this monumental voyage and, more broadly, the immigrant story.
The centerpiece of that space is a large boat, about 25 feet long, which is called the Trade Wind. And even though it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the story of Norwegian immigration, it does have something to do with the story of Norwegians in America. And so that ship was sailed by 2 brothers coming to the Chicago World's Fair in 1933. So the brothers came over here. There was a big World's Fair kind of showcasing their feat. At one time, it was the smallest ship or boat that crossed the Atlantic Ocean. So it's kind of an exciting thing for them to do. One of the brothers did actually stay in the United States for a short amount of time, and then went back to Norway. And that's something that we're hoping to share a little bit more of, is that, oftentimes we think of immigrants as coming to a place to actually stay, but immigration, migration, even in the Norwegian experience, is way more fluid than we might think. So why did Norwegians come to the United States in the 19th and early 20th centuries? Well, a lot of them came here to the United States for more opportunities. And while it may seem like a simplification or an oversimplification of the reasons for Norwegian immigration to the United States, we can start to sort of boil down those reasons to 2 or 3 factors. And those factors are peace, pox, and potatoes. In 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte was defeated, but prior to that, he was waging war all across Europe and into North Africa, and that affected a lot of countries, including Norway. And so people were not only engaged in war, but there were also other things going on, like famines. Now, Norway was allied with Denmark, which happened to be ultimately on the losing side because they allied themselves with France. But after 1815, no more war going on, lack of famine, and relative peace. So people were living longer lives, obviously, because they weren't dying from these other causes. Another reason for immigration was the introduction of the vaccination for smallpox. Smallpox was a very deadly disease, but this vaccination helped people to live longer and healthier lives. Also in Norway, people started eating potatoes. Now, potatoes are a New World crop. They do originate in the Andes Mountains, but were brought over with explorers back to the continent, to the European continent. And the Norwegians were quite reluctant initially to try potatoes because they happen to be a part of the nightshade family of plants, which are largely poisonous. But due to the famines that were in Norway during the Napoleonic Wars, people were kind of forced to start eating potatoes, and they found, wow, these are good, they're nutritious, and they will grow in the rocky soil of Norway. So a lot of people were living healthier, longer lives. So these factors combined to create a population explosion in Norway. And so more people were living longer and healthier lives, but that doesn't mean that there were more jobs or that there was more land and that there were more opportunities, just more people. But those aren't the only factors, and they're certainly not the only factors that might push or pull immigrants today. So, for example, the first organized group of Norwegians to come to the United States were the sloopers. They arrived in 1825, and the vast majority of them were either Quakers or members of the Haugian movement. And so all of these people were dissenters against the Lutheran Church. So those people were coming more for religious reasons. Well, coming to America was no small feat. You would have to get a ship, you have to get your passage, and you'd also have to do some packing. So over beside me here is sort of some typical contents of an immigrant trunk. What people may have chosen to pack, or some ideas of things that people did pack to bring to the United States, especially in the 19th century. Sometimes trunks have this beautiful painting on it that is known as rose mauling, but other times the trunks have just ironwork on them, or they're very, very plain. And then thinking about all of the things that you would need on the journey, but then also need when you got to your destination here in the United States. So we can kind of categorize these materials here, these objects that would go into the trunk, into kind of sections. So clothing would be important to have, not only what you're wearing, but maybe some spare clothing. So up here are some socks, some bedding. Inside of the trunk, tucked inside, is a blanket that you could use on board the ship, or in your new home. You might need some utensils for your house, or to eat with, some tools. And so there's a number of things that relate to food here, food preparation, and being able to eat food. So there's some bowls, some utensils for eating and for cooking, and also a coffee pot or a teapot, a bigger kettle, or a pot over there, things that you would need to set up your house. Also, there are a number of tools that might have been brought with them, and examples of that might be, in this case here, a knife, which can be very useful, and then also some sewing or textile production tools. There happens to be a spinning wheel in here, as well as some cards for carding wool. But sometimes people want to bring things that maybe aren't necessarily useful, but have some sentimental value. And I think there are a couple of those things here that I can point out. One of them would be this mangle board, or this mangla tray, which is a kind of iron that works on the principle of friction. So the cloth would be wrapped around this dowel here, and then this board would be held by the handle and placed perpendicular to the dowel, and the cloth would be rubbed back and forth and back and forth. As I said, it works on the principle of friction, so if you rub your hands together, it creates a little heat, and that's how the cloth would get pressed. Well, sort of a useful tool, but not necessarily during the time when people were immigrating, because there were other types of irons by that time. But this would also would have been a betrothal gift in some communities in rural Norway. So a man would carve one of these for the woman that he intended to marry, and if she accepted him, then she would bring that into the house, and that would mean yes. And if she didn't accept him, then she would just leave that on the doorstep, and the man would unfortunately have to take that back. And no regifting. He couldn't give this to another woman if he asked another woman to marry him. So apparently in Norway there's a saying that you should beware of the man with many mangles. So if he has a lot of these in his closet, he may not be the best for marrying and creating a life with him. Also here we have a beautiful butter mold or cheese mold. It creates a beautiful pattern on the outside of the piece, or the cheese or the butter here, but not necessarily practical, but would have been something for very special occasions in Norway. And perhaps it was a family heirloom. So thinking about things that have personal meaning, and also things that you can bring with you to keep your traditions alive in your new home. Well, immigration or migration is not necessarily always about people, but it's also about the traditions that they bring with them or take with them. And people have been bringing traditions with them to the places where they've settled for a long, long time. And in Vesterheim's collection, We have a huge number of pieces that represent tradition or are about tradition, and not only tradition in the past, but tradition moving forward. And behind me here are a couple of pieces that represent one tradition in Norway, and that is the tradition of acanthus carving. There's a beautiful cupboard behind me that has this acanthus carving, this stylized leaf carving that actually isn't from Norway. If you know anything about art history or have gone to Greece or to Italy, or even to places of the old Byzantine Empire, then you have seen this leaf, this acanthus leaf. It's actually indigenous or native to the Mediterranean. And this leaf, this stylized leaf, this pattern, this design made its way eventually into Norway and became very, very popular in the 1700s and then into the 1800s. And in fact, so popular that schools developed to teach this particular kind of carving. And so we have this older piece here behind me, and then a newer piece that was done by an artist not so many years ago, but the same style, this design, traveling through time and traveling with people. Well, along with the many things that immigrants from Norway brought with them in their trunks, they might also be bringing special skills with them, as well as their traditions. And we can see evidence of those things here today at Vesterheim, where we not only have pieces that are decorated and that are historic pieces, but we also have a lot of beautifully decorated pieces that are contemporary pieces made by artists today. Well, behind me here are a number of objects that people brought with them in their trunks from Norway, and they represent many of the hand skills that people long ago in Norway had. And again, those skills that people today are continuing to use. So there are examples here of burnt decoration, of incised work, lots of ways to decorate very useful wooden objects. And objects that would be, used sometimes for special occasions and to celebrate very certain traditions, but then sometimes also used for every day. And that's really what folk art is. It's objects that are made by people to actually use. So in thinking about traditions that people would bring with them, we can look to a lot of food traditions. And even today, many immigrants are bringing food traditions with them. And perhaps you also have many food traditions from your past relatives or ancestors that you celebrate today. So for example, we have a box over here that would maybe be used for holding a special pudding called immigrant. It's a porridge that would be served at special occasions like Christmas or for christening. It also has some beautiful decoration on it as well as some symbols. And as you look at the museum's collection, you'll also see a lot of those shapes, those repeated patterns, those symbols that long ago were meant to ensure good luck and protection for a lot of the users of these particular items.
These items are at the heart of Vesterheim. Even today, Vesterheim is adding newly found artifacts to its already remarkable collection. You may wonder then where we keep our collection. Laurann Gilbertson, Vesterheim's chief curator, will show you.
We have several different storage areas so that we can be sure that the objects are well cared for. Different kinds of materials and different objects have different needs. So in textile storage, we've got spaces for small things like mittens, large things like garments, quilts, and we also have a space for, we call it small object storage, but it's trunk-sized and smaller. That might include some of our tools, folk art pieces, and smaller art pieces. We have fine art storage. We also have spaces for very large objects like furniture. And then some of our largest objects, our buildings, are behind the museum in our Heritage Park. Like most museums, we only have a fraction of our collection on view at any one time. And most museums do that so that they can have a rich body of work to share and also be able to rotate pieces so that nothing becomes damaged by light or heat or display. There are about 33,000 objects here at Vesterheim, and they range in size from maybe a marble or a button up until a 3-story stone mill. We have 12 historic structures, we have 5,500 textiles, we have 3,000 pieces of fine art, and we have several thousand pieces of folk art, including contemporary folk art.
From outside, the building dedicated to holding these small objects is unremarkable. However, just inside you'll find row upon row of artifacts that seem to hallow the air. The space is almost sacred. In this room, you'll find objects of exquisite beauty and craft, oftentimes layered with history centuries old.
I love to learn more about the objects, what they meant to the people who used them and made them, and more of the stories behind the pieces. This is a sewing box that has come through 11 generations of a family. It was not only passed down through the family, but the women had recorded all of the different owners. And one of the ways they recorded that was with different monograms with initials and dates. So you can see 1653, 1685, 1709. It was passed to the oldest daughter in the family, and then it did shift a little bit to come with a woman who was immigrating. I think because she was immigrating, the family wanted her to have it to bring. Her name was Diederika Brandt, and she came to Decorah, Iowa. Her husband was pastor at a small Lutheran college, and she would often use this box and its contents to do mending for the male students. This was the 1860s and 70s. And she invited other women in the community to help with the mending, and they ended up starting what was known as Ladies' Aid. That was something popular in many churches, to create textiles to sell to benefit the church and the community. Not only did each woman get recorded with her initials and date, but each one contributed a tool. And so inside there are some different textile tools that were contributed by the different owners, and was donated recently to Vesterheim by the 11th owner through time. Vesterheim is especially well known for our Norwegian folk art collection. These are objects that were brought by immigrants from Norway to America, and represent some truly outstanding pieces and examples of decorative painting, woodworking, metalsmithing, weaving. You'll notice that we have a large number of bowls. Many of these bowls had been used for drinking beer in Norway. This was an important tradition that you brew beer specially and then drink and share with family and friends for weddings, at Christmas. Even at funerals, it was accustomed to each take a drink to toast the departed. They're often beautifully painted and beautifully turned. Some of them have small feet on them. There's a variety of sizes. If it's a smaller one like this, you might each take a drink and pass it around. There are also larger bowls that would hold beer, and then you would have a smaller bowl floating inside to take an individual drink. And all kinds of decoration, both on the outside and on the inside. You'll notice that some of them have inscriptions, and these might be references to the original tree that was growing, and now it's a bowl. It might say something like, "Have a drink, my friend." And so these often have both beautiful stylized floral patterns as well as beautiful letters and sometimes dates. And we have wonderful examples of contemporary folk art done within the tradition. And this is one of my favorites. This is a bowl by Ethel Qualheim, who was Rose Mahler, a decorative painter in Stoughton, Wisconsin. And she's known for just beautiful, beautiful design and also a little innovation. We saw the previous bowl with the inscription on the outside. This one does not have that. The inscription is here in a ring in the center, which is a creative and beautiful way to do it. This is painted in the Telemark regional style. There are some different regional styles, and the Telemark style is often known for having a strong C or S curve and not being overly symmetrical. The challenge for the artist, though, is to create beautiful balance in both the motifs and the color, and certainly Ethel Qualheim did that with this.
Since its inception, Vesterheim has worked to preserve and share folk art, whether made by renowned artists like Ethel Qualheim and Sigmund Orseth, or unnamed ancestors from the 18th century. Vesterheim's textile storage is an ideal place to explore the legacy of folk artists in the Norwegian tradition. There are over 5,500 textile examples in its collection.
We've had textiles since very early on in our years of collecting, and we've got a really nice range. It includes some pieces that were brought from Norway by immigrants, and it also includes pieces that were made and used here in the U.S. One example of some of those brought items are wool coverlets. The Norwegian name for this is okle, and these were brought because families had to provide their own bedding on the ship. They would bring whatever bedding they were using at home, so we also have examples of feather-filled comforters, sheepskins that were also used as bedding. Some of these kinds of pieces had second lives. Their first life would be on a bed, but their second lives might be as a wrap around a baby at baptism, or maybe in some places in Norway you would kneel on these during the wedding ceremony. The primary use, though, was on beds and brought to America. Here they were not so much used because they looked a little too old-fashioned or old country, but they were saved as cherished mementos by many families. These okler are colorful, they're woven at home, and beautiful examples of different textile patterns. Some of these techniques are used with our folk art classes here at the museum today. So they're learning examples like this technique that's called rutevev, a geometric tapestry. We also have krukbragd, which is used all over Norway. Its name means crooked path, and so the motifs are often a little bit zigzaggy. One pattern that is very popular on all kinds of folk art, knitting, weaving, wood carving, metalsmithing, is an 8-petal flower. It looks to us a little bit like a star or a snowflake, but the Norwegians would call it åttebladsrosa, or 8-petal flower. This is a beaded piece that goes in the front of some of the national costumes, and done in beadwork with imported beads originally from Italy. And this 8-petal flower motif is an ancient motif and appears not only in Norway but in many countries in folk art. It's a stylized sun symbol, and the sun represented goodness and warmth, and by using this motif it was hoped that the goodness of the sun could be channeled, so bringing goodness, good luck to a person, to their household, and also to their agricultural pursuits. So it's especially interesting to me when we've got objects that were made according to Norwegian tradition in the US. And it's also very interesting to me when some of those objects have been adapted. For example, Hardanger embroidery, which is a very popular white work embroidery in Norway. When it came here, Americans had a greater access to supplies and had some perhaps freedom in what they could create. So we have pieces that were made here using colored threads and maybe had borders of other kinds of lace trim. So showing an adaptation and an evolution here in the United States. It wasn't very common for immigrants to bring entire outfits because they knew people dressed differently here. But it was very common to bring maybe one piece or two pieces. And this vest was brought by a man who was coming from Svorkmo, which is near the city of Trondheim. He brought this piece that was not new at the time. It actually was about 100 years old when he brought it. And he chose to wear it when he married in Wisconsin. He had met a girl on board the ship, and they married in Wisconsin. And he wore this vest. He decided to freshen it up a little bit, though. The original vest would have had very large brass or pewter or silver buttons. And for his wedding, they switched to the more stylish American cut steel buttons for the wedding. So not a whole outfit, but a single piece. Very occasionally, though, we do have full outfits that were brought. This is an everyday garment from Gudbrandsdal, which is in eastern Norway, and it has a striped skirt and a plaid vest. This is one of those times you can wear stripes and plaid together. And the festive version, maybe for church or festivals, holidays, would be similar in cut, but would have embroidery. And this embroidered version, the festive version, is what has lived on today in what the Norwegians call bunader. Bunad means national costume. So the costumes that you might see in Norway today, also in Norwegian settlements around the world, are modern outfits, but often very firmly based in the history and paying honor to this beautiful folk costume tradition. Well, to talk about a bunad, we have to go back in time to when people were wearing a certain kind of clothing in the rural areas. So if we go back to the 1700s and 1800s, people were wearing clothing that they had made themselves, hand woven, hand embroidered. And for festive occasions, there were often embroidery added, special trim. And this folk dress that was present in the past in the rural areas started to die out in the late 1800s as European fashion was coming into Norway. And then around 1900, there was an interest in reviving this rural dress as a way to show Norway's strong traditional ties. Norway was about to become independent from Sweden, that after years of rule under Denmark. And they were looking back into their own past to see what was traditionally Norwegian. And there was an interest in having this clothing used again. It was simplified and standardized somewhat after 1900, and so this slightly more simplified and standardized version is called bunad. The plural is bunader, and it's what the Norwegians translate as national costume. There are different outfits for different parts of Norway. Some communities have multiple options, and some of them are very strongly based in the past. In some communities, the old styles of clothing were very well known and even used. In a few valleys in Hallingdal, Setesdal, Telemark, women were wearing their folk costume, folk dress, into the 20th century. These are two examples of Norwegian bunader. The singular for that is bunad, and these are national costumes. These are pieces made in recent years, but do show a tie back to the past to honor Norway's folk dress tradition. Some of the ones that are made today and worn, like this one from East Telemark, look very much like what had been worn in the 1800s and in the 1700s. And so it's been copied from the past quite closely and is available for people to wear today. Other bunads are recreated. Perhaps the folk dress tradition had died out in an area at the time when this idea was starting to be revived and refreshed. And so this one from Norway is an example of one that had to be more creatively put together with traditional elements. For example, they found an old piece that had similar embroidery to this, and then put this together with other traditionally and locally inspired pieces. In Nordland, which is in northern Norway, there are two basic bunads. They are very similar. There's a blue one if your family had lived on the coast, and a green one if your family had lived inland as farmers. And so we can see some beautiful floral embroidery. There's a plaid apron. And another important part of the Norwegian folk dress tradition is silver jewelry. Norway is one of the few places in the world where silver has been found. And so Norway has long had a very strong tradition of using silver for jewelry, buttons, buckles, and it's honored today in all of these national costumes. It's very common that you might have one large brooch, or it might be several brooches like on the Telemark costume. For festive occasions in the old days, there might be 3 or 4 even, and these might be pieces that were handed down from a mother or grandmother. Sometimes girls received a brooch for confirmation, and these were often cherished, handed down, and are beautiful parts of these outfits. Some of the outfits, like this one from East Telemark, you'll notice have extra pieces. So this one has decorative eyelets. It could be that there would be a chain run through these to lace up the bodice, but sometimes they're just there for decoration. And the Norwegian silversmiths have done beautiful, beautiful work. If you see a gold-colored brooch, it's silver but with a gold wash. Underneath it's that beautiful silver from Norway. Many of the bunads, in addition to having embroidery, which might be the first thing we notice, have other special components. And weaving, hand-woven pieces are part of many of the national costumes. This is a very wide belt created with a technique called card or tablet weaving, and it goes around and around the waist multiple times. Some of the bunader have hand-woven trim, but since the very early days of folk dress in Norway, there have always been imported elements. So even in the 17 and 1800s, there might be some imported trim from Italy or beads from Italy that were part of the costumes. Another characteristic of some of the Norwegian folk costumes is that there's a wonderful combination of geometric and floral patterns. Things aren't too matchy, and that's what makes them so wonderful. So we don't necessarily see exactly the same color in each place. There's this richness of technique and tradition in each of these outfits. We also have some things here at Vesterheim that maybe you wouldn't expect. For example, we have a pair of suspenders that were from Norway, and there are no complete pairs like this in Norway right now. And it's a man's knickers and vest, quite old, probably 1700s, and this represents the folk dress tradition, the way people were dressing in the old days in rural Norway. The knickers are made out of moose hide leather, and the vest is made of lamb's leather. The vest is decorated with stitching. The person has taken 2 rows of stitching and pulled it tight, so you get a raised pattern here on the vest, this beautiful floral pattern. It's also decorated with small red embellishments on the buttonholes, and the buttons are made from old coins. The back of the vest is hand-woven fabric, and some of that sewn decoration is on the men's knickers as well. Another part of this outfit that makes it very special are the suspenders that are here laying on the front of the pants. The suspenders have small initials and date cut out of brass and attached to the suspenders, but it has initials and the date of 1762. We've been in touch with scholars in Norway who found this very interesting, and that's great for us to be able to share with them and to be able to preserve it not just for Americans, but for Norwegians as well.
Vesterheim was founded to preserve and distill the experience of Norwegian immigrants and Norwegian American ancestors for exhibition and education. Part of this nearly 150-year effort has involved Vesterheim's Folk Art School. Leah Lovelace, director of the Folk Art School, explains what makes learning folk art essential to today's audiences.
You know, I think folk art is a special kind of tradition because originally folk art was done by people in their homes with what they had. It's about sort of personalizing, adorning things that were their everyday items and sharing the stories of the people who made those items. And so that's very translatable to today too. There are many folk artists in Norway who are sort of taking those disciplines and reinterpreting them in response to our current life, current materials, current events, current experiences. One of our best assets is having an extensive folk art collection. And it can't all be seen in the museum, but there's such a great amount of it in the museum. But then we have all of this behind the scenes folk art that if you come for a class at Vesterheim, you get a chance to access and see. And you'll see that our instructors are building classes often that are inspired by works in our collection. It might be about an object that's in our collection that they're helping people to recreate in a class, but it could also be that it's a way to look back at some really amazing, rich examples to inspire your own practice and your own journey. I would say that, you know, that's one of the things about Vesterheim that makes us unique and different is that we're very much connected to folk art of the past, but we also want people to understand that folk art is about carrying traditions forward. It's a chance to have some empathy for generations that came before us, but it's also a chance to be creative and explore and translate your own identity into a very unique piece.
We hope you've enjoyed our program. This video will continue with an interactive Q&A session led by our Chief Curator, Laurann Gilbertson.
We hope you enjoyed your visit of Vesterheim Norwegian American Museum and a look behind the scenes. I'm so pleased you're joining us today for Museum Monday and Viking.TV. I'm Laurann Gilbertson, Chief Curator, and I'm pleased to be able to talk with you today and try to answer some of your questions. A few questions have already come in, but if you can think of some other ones, please add them and I'll try to get to as many as possible. Our first question comes from Shania in Charlottesville. She asked where the items within the museum come from. Are they real or replicas? Well, we're very lucky to have almost all real items in the museum. There are certainly a few replicas, but most of them are real. We've been a museum since 1877, and so objects have been coming in over the years, and we have a wonderfully rich resource to share with you through our exhibitions, both the core exhibitions that you see whenever you come and visit, or the special ones that we put up from time to time. Even the ship, the trade wind ship, that was sailed from Norway to the United States for the Chicago Exposition in the 1930s is a real artifact. We also have a question from Sunny of Downers Grove. Does the museum offer any classes on Viking crafts brought over from North America, from Norway or Scandinavia? We offer a wide variety of classes in fiber arts, wood carving, decorative painting, silversmithing, metalsmithing, a wide range. Many of them are skills, handwork skills that probably would have been used in the Viking times, like some of the carving classes. But for the motifs and the specifics, most of the ones that we have are from, we would maybe call it the more recent historical period, so the 1800s, the 1700s. But we do from time to time have a class with a theme that might be Viking style carving. So just keep an eye out on Vesterheim's website and you might see a class from time to time that would be a more Viking specific class. Let's see what else we have for questions. Rosalie in Bloomington, how did a Norwegian museum end up in the United States? Well, it was because Norwegian immigrants and Norwegian Americans here decided that they wanted to preserve the stories of their immigrant ancestors. And so our museum started on the campus of Luther College. The very first objects to come in came in 1877. And by 1890s, the faculty and alumni had decided that Norwegian immigrant material should be a stated focus of the collection. So at that time, they were thinking of their parents' memories, the immigrants, but now certainly the stories are from immigrants today, Norwegians who have come during the 20th century and 21st century, as well as those folks that came in the 1800s to America. Was there a particular area of Norway from which most early immigrants originated? And this is a question from Bill in Windsor, Ontario. Yes, there were some areas in Norway that had particularly high levels of emigration, and some of those areas were in the southern part of the country where farmland became more and more limited as land was passed on. At first it was divided among the children, and the parcels became so small that it was necessary to only pass land in whole to the oldest son, or if there were no oldest sons, the oldest daughter. So there weren't other properties that could be purchased. It was hard to find new farmland if that was what you had wanted to be doing, farming. And so we see particularly high levels of emigration, people leaving from southern Norway, Hordaland, Telemark, in particular, Hallingdal, those areas in the south, particularly high levels of emigration. Tiana in Jacksonville Beach wondered about a quintessential dish that Norwegian Americans make to honor their heritage. Perhaps the most famous or infamous is lutefisk, which is a live preserved cod that is often eaten at Christmas time. But people perhaps more fondly would think of some of the cookies. There are some wonderful cookies. Again, jokingly, people say that they're made of all white ingredients, so eggs and butter and sugar and flour, but you can put them together in lots of different combinations for delicious little sand tarts or deep fried rosettes. So those might be some of the favorites, but lutefisk is probably by far the most famous. People love to hate it. It's often eaten out of tradition or custom rather than enjoyment, but it's certainly an important part of Norwegian American history. Clifford in Charlotte, North Carolina, we were expecting this question. It's about the murals behind me. I'm currently in one of Vesterheim's building, and this is a space that we call the gathering room that we use for meetings and presentations. It was decorated by Sigmund Orseth, a Norwegian painter, as well as Sally Haugen de Roos, an Iowa painter. And the room along the outside walls has depictions of scenes from everyday life, and also scenes that relate to specific important points in Norway's history. There's a brown chair rail behind me, and just above that is an orange band that has motifs from early calendar sticks. The primstav was a way for people to keep track of holy days and holidays. And this was in Catholic times when Norway was a Catholic country. This was after Christianity and before the Lutheran Reformation in the 1530s. It was important to keep track of what day it was, because if there was a holiday, a holy day, or a saint's day, that needed to be observed. So they would have either a long stick or maybe a more circular shape that would have these symbols that represented the different saints' days. And they could follow along and see when these needed to be observed. So there are some symbols along that chair rail behind me, and those are representing the saints' days. Then in the pictures up above, there are scenes that represent those saints or other important activities. So behind me, there's a woman sitting on a chair holding a book. This represents the Mass of Mary Magdalene. And there's also a dog in this image, and this refers to something that might relate more to nature or culture. It's there to represent sort of the dog days of the year when you might have some very nice weather. It's a good time to be safe to be swimming. There are other scenes around the room that relate to nature, like the day you're supposed to be prepared for winter. And this is symbolized by a mitten, and that date is October 14th. It's coming up, so be sure to be prepared for winter. So these are wonderful murals that give you the opportunity to learn a little bit more about Norwegian history as well as Norwegian nature. All right, let's take another question. This is from Loma in Philadelphia. She wonders how we're dealing with COVID-19 at the moment, and are we currently open or closed to the public? Currently, we're closed to visitors. The staff are all working behind the scenes, but we're not able to welcome visitors at this time. Hopefully that will change and we'll be able to have you on site soon. We are, since you can't come and visit in person, we are trying to ramp up our online activities. So if you visit the Vesterheim website, vesterheim.org, you can see a variety of options that you can take part in from home. We have programs for children called Barnetimen, or the Children's Hour, meant for kindergartners and other children. We also have lectures and presentations, and you can even take a class online. You might also be able to learn a little bit about some of the folk artists who have been very heavily involved with Vesterheim as teachers and as participants, and look on the website for something called Gold Medalist Portfolio to learn more about artists. And because I'm a collections person, I'm going to put a plug in for our virtual galleries. These are listings of just a few of our artifacts, but you have a chance to take a closer look at the object and learn a little bit about its history. You can go on to see fine art, silver and metal, wood carving, textiles of all kinds, and rose mauling or decorative painting. So we hope you'll visit the website if you can't visit us in person for a little while. Giuseppe in Atlanta asks if there's a book that I recommend to learn more about Norwegian American history. There are lots of good ones, but a great basic is by Odd Lovell, who was a professor at St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota. And he has a book that is a wonderful overview. It talks about some of the reasons Norwegians chose to leave, when they settled here, where did they settle, what was life like, as well as some of the more established immigrant history, like the organizations that people formed and significant Norwegian Americans that you may have heard from. So I would recommend any of the books by Odd Lovell. That's Oddlovoll. Let's see about another question. Bill in Windsor asks if Vesterheim has any Viking relics that made their way to the museum. We have one authentic Viking artifact. We have a sword, and it was transferred to our museum from a museum in Norway. It's one that had been in a burned grave, so it shows signs of not only long-term preservation, but burning. And normally a Viking artifact would be unlikely to make its way to a museum in the United States in the permanent collection. But because this one was a transfer, we're able to have it. Vesterheim is lucky that in the 1920s and 30s, a number of Norwegian museums sent gifts of, I guess you could say, extras from their collections to us. The goal was to help the Norwegians in America remember their homelands and their old lives and the old history. And so a number of museums sent objects that you'll be able to see both in the virtual galleries online and when you visit in person, and some really wonderful pieces that have made their way here as gifts from Norwegian museums. Dakota in Bristol had noticed the image that was used on Viking.TV of people dancing in front of the museum. And the question is, do we usually put on Norwegian themed events? Our museum does some regular events, such as a Norwegian Christmas event in years that are not COVID years, but that photograph was taken during Nordic Fest, which is a citywide festival held the last full weekend in July. And it's been an opportunity for our community to come together and offer a variety of options related to Norwegian history and culture. So like many good festivals, there are food booths, there's dancing and music. There are also special exhibitions of fine handcraft, as well as locally made craft. And so that happens most years. Again, this is not our typical year, unfortunately, but most years in the last full weekend in July. Wesley wanted to know, out of all of the collection, what would be my favorite piece? That's such a hard question because I love them all. Maybe not all of them as much, but I do love so many of the pieces. I think that the pieces that often speak to me most are the ones that have human stories behind them, because even if a piece is spectacularly beautiful, I think we can often connect better to the human stories. One of my favorites is a pair of slipper socks, I guess you could call them. It's a hand knit sock with a reinforced sole, and it's a very typical and traditional piece of Norwegian footwear called the luga, L-U-G-G-A. And these were used in Norway inside the house, but also outside the house when the snow was dry. It was a way to extend the life of your leather footwear or your wooden footwear. And it's something that's very ingrained in Norwegian culture. Well, certainly some of those ideas came with the immigrants to America, and I had the opportunity to talk to members of a family that continued to make those in Minnesota. So I think that the pair that we have from that family is one of my all-in-all favorites, because I got to meet the family members and talk to them and hear the stories about how their mother and grandmother had made these in Minnesota for all of the kids and grandkids, and to just feel like you were part of that family story. So that's definitely one of my favorites. Also, Wesley wanted to know about how much time to allow if you come to visit the museum. Great question. Definitely at least an hour. We have in our visitor guide an easy suggestion of how you can make it through the museum in an hour and see lots of favorite things, very special objects, but you could certainly stay all day. We've got 4 floors of exhibitions. We've got historic houses that have been moved onto the site, and in the months when the weather is good, you can go inside those houses with a guide and have a look. We have a wonderful museum store, and then if you were coming at a time that we perhaps had a lecture or class, you'd want to stay even longer. I'll put a plug in for Decorah as well. We have a wonderful town here, and Vesterheim is located on the west end of our main downtown street, Water Street, and so it's great when you're here to just stroll, take a look at the shops and restaurants, and you can either also explore a lot of nature while you're here. We have beautiful hills, limestone cliffs, and even a waterfall, which is a little bit special for Iowa. So it's a great place to come. Dovey in New York City asked about the most popular item that people buy when they visit the museum. That's a great question. We have a variety of things in the museum store. Certainly food is a favorite thing for people to buy. We usually have Norwegian chocolate and cookies and some other favorites like fish balls in a can that you can take home and enjoy. Some people choose a book, but very often people choose some sort of piece of folk art. And in the museum store, we have a variety of things that were made by local and national artists in some of these same techniques that you were seeing in the tour earlier on Viking.TV, the rose mauling, the decorative painting, or the wood carving, silversmithing. Norway has a wonderful tradition of silver jewelry, and so you might like to take home a silver brooch called a solja that was used by children and women, and even men had silver pins as well. So that might be something you'd like to take with you. We can see what other questions that we have. Gotten some great questions. Thank you, everyone, and feel free to send another question. Brianna in Jacksonville Beach asked about whether we've helped American families find their ancestors in Norway. Yes and no. Not as much currently because we used to have a genealogy center here associated with us, but that's now an independent organization in Madison, Wisconsin that I would highly recommend if any of you are interested in researching your ancestors, finding more out about when people came and where, and I'll give you their website. This is the Norwegian American Genealogical Center and Nesset Library in Madison, Wisconsin, and their website is nagcnl.org. And what we can help you best with here in Decorah is a little less of the movements of people and the specifics of where your ancestors might be coming from. We can help you better with understanding the lives they lived before they left and the lives they lived once they got here. We have wonderful objects that can help bring those stories alive. And then, of course, settings here too. For example, we've got log houses that would represent some of the very first immigrants to the Midwest, and you would have a chance to see how possibly your ancestors had lived when they came here. All right, we'll grab a couple more questions. One of the questions is about whether we loan objects to other museums. And yes, we do. We're very pleased to share the collection as broadly as possible. And so we love it when other museums are interested in exhibiting some of our objects. Right now, we have some exhibits at the National Nordic Museum in Seattle, at the American Swedish Institute in Minneapolis, and we're preparing to send some pieces on an exhibition of mid-century design that will be exhibited in both Los Angeles and Milwaukee, and a major exhibition of bunader, the Norwegian national costumes, and that will be opening later this year in Santa Fe, New Mexico at the Museum of International Folk Art. So that's a great favorite of ours, is getting to see our pieces go out. It's also a wonderful thing for you wherever you're living, because there's a chance that some of our collection might be coming closer to you. And certainly if you are checking our website, that's a great way to explore our collection a little bit better too. I think we can take one more question. And here is a question about Luther College. We have a long history with Luther College that's located here in Decorah, Iowa. Our collection began on the campus of Luther College in 1877. And we've been in the very same building in downtown Decorah since the 1930s. So when you're able to come and visit, you'll see us in a beautiful brick building that started as a hotel and was later a publishing house and has been Vesterheim since the early 1930s. Well, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us for Museum Monday on Viking.TV. A special thank you to my colleagues at Vesterheim and Viking River Cruises for helping us introduce you to what our museum has to offer on a future visit to Decorah, Iowa. So until you're able to visit, please stay safe and well. Thank you.